class, we're going to continue looking at the theme of economic development in this state. I'm going to read from two selections. The first is a chapter from the Aoki et al. Book, and this is a chapter by Hyun-Ki Kim and Jun Ma. It's trying to look at how the petrochemical industry in East Asia in 3 different countries developed, and what was the role of government in acquiring technological capabilities. That's a fairly important theme, and even though there are many other things to look at on the role of government, I thought this particular selection would be particularly interesting and relevant. Second is a chapter from Pranab Bardhan's book from 2010, Comparing India and China. And I'm going to look at the institutions of capitalism that he describes in China and India, and just try and explain how did private capital and private investment develop in the two countries, at least until 2010.
So this chapter starts like this. As Gershon Krohn observed, in spite of many handicaps, the relatively backward countries have the one great asset of the technological knowledge accumulated by advanced countries. In other words, technological knowledge has already been accumulated by advanced countries, and developing countries have the ability to take advantage of that prior knowledge. However, developing countries cannot take advantage of this asset unless they develop the technological competence to search for appropriate technologies and to select, absorb, adapt, and improve imported technologies. Such a capacity has externalities, that is, its social benefits far exceed the private benefits. So it's not just that individuals have the ability to access technologies like cell phones or whatever else, but the collective effect, the social advantages are greater, exceed some of the individual private benefits. That's what is known as externalities here, positive externalities here. Hence, the role of government in facilitating the process of acquiring technological competence is crucial. It is particularly critical when the technology is highly sophisticated, entails substantive setup costs and scale economies, as well as strong backward and forward linkages, as in the case of sectors such as iron and steel and petroleum and its derivatives. When you have these advanced technologies involving complex technological knowledge and an assemblage of elements required to make these technologies work properly, requiring things like fuel, requiring other conditions, land, maybe access to water, maybe access to other types of equipment, skilled technicians, all of these kinds of things, plus scale economy. What are economies of scale? Economies of scale occur when it becomes cheaper to start producing more and more units compared to a fixed number of units, because you already have the infrastructure. Your marginal cost of producing additional units starts to decline. That's called economies of scale. What are economies of scope? Economies of scope occur when you can start producing multiple types of products from the same factory, and that becomes advantageous to you. So when you start thinking that you want to actually produce, say, one good like electricity, then you realize, well, you can also produce a byproduct as your energy conversion process, and that can be sold for a profit. Then that translates into an economy of scope. That's not mentioned here, but there could be certain types of advanced technologies that involve those kinds of processes as well. And it requires the capacity to be able to make use of all these kinds of advantages. The backward and forward linkages apply to supply chains. Are all the raw materials required for this technological process available? Are they available at the same time? Forward linkages having to do with what are your marketing channels? How do we actually send these out to retail? Is there sufficient demand? Is there sufficient space for storage? How do we manage all of these kinds of things? And so the sectors that are mentioned here, iron and steel, petroleum and its derivatives, are classic examples of technologies, advanced technologies requiring all of these kinds of features. Further, absorption of sophisticated technology takes time. During this gestation lag, an enterprise requires protection from imports in accordance with the well-known infant industry argument. So you've heard this time and again from Ha-Joon Chang onwards. When there are strong interlinkages among different sectors and or enterprises, there exists the problem of coordinated development. The social benefits of such coordinated development are much greater than the private benefits can potentially be. Here again, there is a role for the state to act as a catalyst for coordinating the investment behavior of related sectors or enterprises. In addition to these arguments, government intervention also finds support in the case of, quote, strategic interdependence in international markets. So skipping forward, we come to why these authors decide to choose the petrochemical industry. We had several reasons for choosing the petrochemical industry as an illustration. First, this industry is often one of the major targets for promotional policy. What they mean by promotional here is that the petrochemical industry can be a platform from which a whole series of various types of industrial products, including plastics and fertilizers and so on, can be developed. So it can launch a whole set of industrial manufacturing processes. Second, petrochemical industry generally calls for massive transfers of technology and capital from advanced economies for its operation. During the first phase, 1955 to 60, of promoting the petrochemical industry in Japan, royalty payments for the licensing of technologies amounted to $35 million as compared to $23 million spent for imports of equipment, illustrating the importance of technology licensing. Governments often use control over technology imports as an important policy tool in controlling market entry, as well as in acquiring the requisite technological know-how for enhancing local capability, plant design, engineering, and operation. So there are a lot of costs involved in not just buying the equipment, but also especially in ensuring that we can produce things, goods, by using that equipment, which is another name for technological licensing. Third, the industry is strongly characterized by large initial capital investments, rapidly changing technology, and a high degree of integration with other petroleum or chemical related businesses, thereby necessitating the reliance on foreign investment or supplier credits. While the private sector is financially constrained, as was the case for East Asian economies in their early stages, government can play a role in ensuring the industry's long-term efficiency and competitiveness through controls over market entry, direct provision of financing schemes, and other support measures. Fourth, the industry is highly dependent on both petroleum producers and downstream producers. In petrochemical industries, what are you doing? You're converting raw materials such as crude oil into a variety of different products through the refining process. Between and among these producers, it is important to have a mechanism that coordinates and synchronizes the investment and innovation activities among the upstream, midstream, and downstream sectors. These reasons prompt governments to take a more interventionist policy stance in the petrochemical industry than in many other sectors, although the extent varies widely among them. These are the broad outlines of the huge success story that they're documenting. Taking Japan, Korea, and Taiwan as a whole, their share of world ethylene production was only 2.4% in 1960, and Japan was the only producer in East Asia at the time. Between 1960 and 1992, this share increased eightfold to 20%, indicating the extraordinary swiftness of the industry's development in these economies relative to other parts of the world. The authors go on to then describe the individual countries that they're talking about, and all of these developments are equally impressive during this time period. What were the policies to promote technology acquisition? The petrochemical industry has the reputation of being extremely capital intensive and of employing very sophisticated technology. In the early stages of development, the petrochemical industries in the East Asian economies had two features. Technologies were the most important production input, and most technologies were not available domestically. These features meant that governments could effectively implement their industrial policies by controlling technology imports. Both the licensing of foreign technology and the use of foreign exchange were under government control. So then they are going to look at these aspects of such controls. Three aspects: who took part in formulating the development plan, who made the decisions as to the deployment of policy instruments, how firms were selected to enter the industry and to import technologies, and how foreign technologies and their suppliers were selected, what criteria were used at arriving at these decisions. So I'm skipping through some of these parts, but I would ask you to go through them to make sure that you understand what are the distinctions among these three countries. But let's look at this section, selecting foreign technologies and suppliers. In addition to control over market entry, the three East Asian governments also had important roles in selecting foreign technology suppliers. In Japan, MITI's influence over terms and conditions has often been realized through its direct participation in royalty negotiations and technology transfers. Now, this term MITI, it turns out to be very important. MITI stands for the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. The mid-60s, when royalty rates were lowest, represented the period of the most intensive ministry intervention. Its approval requirements served to reduce competition among Japanese firms, especially since MITI sometimes informally designated a particular Japanese firm to negotiate with a specific foreign company. In addition, MITI would delay its approval or make it conditional upon revisions that would lower rates. The success of such interventions was reflected in the strong criticism from technology suppliers. MITI's intervention in technology imports had several features. First, MITI restricted foreign direct investment during the 1950s and 1960s. It favored other means of technology imports, such as purchasing technology licenses and importing equipment, rather than foreign direct investment or FDI. Second, MITI favored unpackaged technology transfers rather than packaged ones. Instead of importing entire plants, Japan's technology imports concentrated on individual items in the form of patent rights, detailed drawings, operating instructions, manuals, and interchange of personnel between Japanese buyers and foreign sellers. In the 1950s and the first half of the 1960s, MITI favored the use of Class B technology agreements, agreements of less than 1 year, or that allow royalty payments only in yen. The total number of Class B technology imports between 1950 and 1964 was some large number, 3,388, while the number of Class A technology agreements, that is, those agreements with the terms of contracts or terms of payment equal to more than 1 year, was lower, roughly the same amount, but still lower. Although most of the Class A technologies were also unpackaged, the degree to which the Class B contracts unpackaged the technologies was obviously higher. By breaking down the elements of a technology as much as was practical, Japanese engineers had participated and often took initiatives in all the stages of detailed design, basic design, construction, and operation. So this turns out to be extremely important for technological learning. You can't learn a technology simply by copying it. You really have to learn how to reassemble it. You really have to learn how to deploy all of its features and to co-design it, or to at least to replicate the design to the extent possible. Third, MITI also objected to technology agreements that limited exports. This may have reflected a divergence of interest between the Japanese buyer of technology and MITI's general economic goals. The Japanese firms may have been willing to trade off export markets for lower royalty rates, but given the government's interest in exports, MITI sometimes would not accept such a trade-off. Yet, despite MITI's dislike of such restrictions, they still happen in many cases. So, MITI's very strong role in technology transfer, in directing technology transfer, is emphasized. The case in Korea was quite different. Korea, which was severely constrained by a shortage of foreign exchange when it was promoting the petrochemical industry, the government had no choice but to rely mainly on foreign investment. The choice of who was to undertake manufacture and what technology they were to employ was therefore inseparable from who was to provide at least some of the capital. The Japanese government in 1968 initiated negotiations with all foreign firms capable of supplying the technology in developing countries. Many suppliers were approached, 13 for polyethylene, 9 for vinyl chloride, etc. In almost all negotiations with foreigners, except on caprolactam, the government imposed increasingly stringent conditions until all but one of the foreign contenders dropped out. With the remaining foreign firm, the government signed a contract for provision of the technology, arranging of finance, training of Koreans as technicians, engineers, managers, supervision of design, construction, and initial production in the petrochemical plant, and organization and responsibilities of the joint venture. So you see rather different strategy in its details, but in its overall arrangement, at least in terms of the strong role that the government played, companies that were involved in technology transfer, and the insistence on training of Korean personnel in multiple parts of this process, you see some similarities with the Japanese case. So an example of how government used the one buyer policy to press the foreign technology supplier to accept deals favorable to the domestic party is the agreement signed between Dow Chemical and Chungju Fertilizer Company. The major clauses were as follows. Dow was to grant an exclusive license for the use of its technology in the joint venture, subject to royalty payment and certain fees for technical assistance. In exchange, the joint venture was to receive all of Dow's know-how, defined as all inventions, trade secrets, technical information, data, shop practices, plans, drawings, blueprints, specifications, and methods possessed by Dow on or prior to November 8, 1968. The joint venture was also received. So you see these rather stringent conditions that the government was able to place on a single supplier. Until the Korean engineers absorbed the technology, Dow would continue to provide engineers from among its own employees. Dow's minimum contribution was listed in terms of the number of men and their responsibilities. Again, to the greatest extent possible, domestically produced inputs would be substituted for imported inputs. In Taiwan, yet another method. The main source of technology was transfers from the United States, Japan, and former West Germany. The main technologies of the first few naphtha cracking plants were imported from DuPont and UPM of the United States. All technology cooperation agreements between local firms and foreign firms were subject to government approval. The government spelled out its policy in the statute for the encouragement of technical cooperation. According to the 1964 version of the law, an agreement for purchasing a product or process technology could be made only if one of these conditions were met. One, the agreement involved production of a new product. Two, the new technology would increase the volume of production, improve quality, or reduce production costs. Or three, the new technology would lead to improvements in management or operation efficiency. In the Taiwanese case, you see the government playing a sort of an arm's length policy, not directing all features of the technology transfer and yet placing certain conditions. So I'm going to skip through some of this, but you can see how the details do matter in each of these different instances. So this example from Korea is instructive. When Korea's first low-density polyethylene power plant was constructed with an output capacity of 50,000 tons per year, which increased to 100,000 tons per year at the second petrochemical complex, along with 60,000 tons per year at a vinyl chloride monomer plant, which increased to 150,000 tons per year at the second petrochemical complex, plus an ethylene dichloride plant with a capacity of 286,000 tons per year. The responsibility for design, construction, and startup was entirely in the hands of the foreign joint venture partner, the Dow Chemical Company. Dow, in turn, engaged an American design firm, Procon, as a prime contractor, while a Korean firm, Dalam Engineering Corp., acted as a subcontractor. When the second petrochemical complex was built in Yeocheon, with more capacity and many technological modifications, a foreign engineering company, Fluor Corporation, was again the prime contractor, but with significant participation by a local engineering firm. So between the early 70s and the mid to late 70s, you already see this transfer taking place. More local procurement, more participation by local engineers, domestic engineers, and so on. And you see this in this table, looking at these two plants. Already you see a huge involvement of Korean engineers by the time the second complex is built. So what the authors are saying is that the rapid development of East Asia's petrochemical industries, particularly in Japan and Korea, stemmed primarily from their extraordinary ability to acquire, absorb, and improve foreign technologies. In contrast, many other countries, such as India and Brazil, started to develop their petrochemical industries in the 1960s and 70s, but have not yet achieved technological mastery in most of the important technologies after about 30 years of development. Of course, this chapter was written in the 1990s, and conditions have since changed. Nevertheless, while the contrast in performances of East Asia and many other countries is clear, whether this performance difference has to do with a difference in government policies is an extremely controversial question. Section 4.2 shows that the East Asian government's involvement in the development of domestic technological capabilities was deep and extensive. But what we still need to ask is whether this government intervention did indeed, and through what mechanisms, contribute to the development of this industry. Clearly, government's role was very important, but the type of government role, the way in which the government acted in each of these cases, was extremely nuanced and carefully developed and distinctive. For instance, the staggered approach announced by MITI in the early 1950s clearly conveyed the message that a few years after the first entry, more firms would be allowed to enter the market. With the government's commitment to such a strategy, firms that were denied access to the market in the first round would make long-term plans for development to gain access to the government-protected market in the future. The potential threat from future entrants, which the government promised, in turn forced the first incumbent to innovate in order to secure its leading position in the market. Among the different methods that the governments used in order to make sure that technology would be absorbed and adapted and used in the local context, most important perhaps, or one of the most important, was this promotion of unpackaging of imported technologies. While 100% TNC subsidiaries and importation transnational corporate subsidiaries and importation of turnkey projects were probably the quickest ways to build up production capacity, the East Asian governments, particularly those of Japan and Korea, consciously realized that this mode of technology transfer would not help the development of local technological capability because the imported technology was treated as a black box. Only by unpackaging an imported technology could local engineers grasp its contents and eventually reproduce or improve it. The governments of Japan and Korea have deliberately promoted the unpackaging of imported technology through three sets of policies. First, Japan and Korea restricted foreign direct investment in the early stages of their development with the objective of maintaining the independence of the industrial sector. Second, instead of importing entire plants, Japan's technology imports concentrated on individual items in the form of patent rights, detailed drawings of patents. You already remember that. Third, the Korean government made deliberate efforts to gain access for local engineers to basic and detailed design of the plants and successfully reduce the need for repeatedly importing the same technology or service. On the other hand, if they had decided to take in packaged imported technologies, there were some costs that were rather subtle. The cost involves the lack of opportunities and incentives for local engineers to engage in technical matters once foreign technicians are present to take care of everything. On the one hand, foreign technology suppliers may tend not to release much technical know-how to local engineers. Joint ventures where foreign equity participation can translate into management control, technical services are often contracted to foreign engineers rather than local engineers. And this is a perennial problem in all countries, including in India. On the other hand, the government does not have sufficient incentive to press the foreign partners hard in negotiations for favorable conditions regarding information release and training of local personnel. The local engineers do not have sufficient incentive to learn technical know-how because they are not responsible for the operation as well as innovation. So you see the advantages and the interesting ways both in Korea and Japan in particular that this technology transfer was managed through unpackaging. In India, 100% multinational subsidiaries and joint ventures accounted for 3 out of 4 major petrochemical complexes. Foreign equity participation was also extensive in Brazil. More than 60% of the petrochemical firms are joint ventures. From the Brazilian point of view, granting TNCs access to equity participation was necessary for obtaining up-to-date technology. So on the one hand, they felt, well, if you have 100% involvement of the foreign company, then you get the latest technology. You don't have to worry about whether the latest technology is coming in. This rationale also reflects many other developing countries' concerns. On the forms of technology imports, many developing countries, including China, India, and Brazil, imported a large number of packaged technologies, which were treated as black boxes by the local technicians. So a related issue has to do with R&D activities. The terms and what is R&D? R&D stands for research and development. The terms and conditions of technology transfers are affected by both the supply and demand sides of the technology. On the supply side, technology suppliers are often monopolistic or oligopolistic and tend to have strong bargaining power. This is especially true of sophisticated technologies such as petrochemical technologies. On the demand side, the buyer's bargaining power depends on its indigenous technological capability. R&D expenditure is an important indicator of the efforts made in developing such capabilities. In addition to obtaining favorable terms and conditions, a strong indigenous R&D infrastructure is also a prerequisite to having the ability to assimilate, adapt, and improve the imported technologies. In the words of Aoki, domestic R&D efforts not only help enterprises unbundle, that is, unpackage foreign technology and identify the technology components most efficient for importation, but also enhance the utility, how you use the imported technology. A weak indigenous R&D infrastructure may be responsible for continuously being dependent on foreign technology. So here then are their concluding remarks. Dealing with government failures. It is widely agreed among economists that government intervention creates rents for favored producers and therefore induces wasteful rent-seeking activities. Casual observation suggests, however, that government-created rents did not produce as many wasteful rent-seeking activities in the East Asian economies as in many other countries, such as India. Why? When rents are created by government intervention, the government can limit the diversion of resources into unproductive rent-seeking activities. The East Asian economies achieved this through the creation of contests based on contingent entry and limited terms of protection. Contingent entry bases the distribution of rents on some pre-announced and well-enforced rules that encourage all participants to enhance their technology and financial capability rather than lobbying. As for limited terms of protection, the rationale is that if the monopoly position and the accompanying rents is too quickly eroded, the private sector will have little incentive to innovate. However, if the monopoly position lasts too long, the cumulative deadweight loss due to its existence will ultimately cancel out the initial productivity gains. So how do the East Asian economies manage to figure out this right formula? It's extremely complex to answer this, they say. But compared with many other developing countries, Japan and Korea have fewer cases where non-governmental forces, wealthy families, ethnic or tribal or regional groups, multinational firms, etc., manage to control the governments. In addition, what Japan and Korea were able to achieve had to do with the way both governments interacted and teamed up with the private sectors in formulating plans and in delineating the terms of entry and so forth. Now, it turns out in the next part of this module, next week, we'll be looking at Atul Kohli's explanation for how Japan and Korea managed to do this. And then this question of information asymmetries, how the governments need access to information, all this also becomes important. The other thing they talk about is the conventional wisdom, economic wisdom, is that governments fail or government failure takes place because governments can't possibly acquire all the information needed to solve these kinds of complex coordination problems. We have shown in this chapter that while a government is not necessarily smarter than the private sector, this argument against government intervention based on informational problems seems to have a damaging effect only on government coordination under significant uncertainty. In the petrochemical case that was discussed in this chapter, uncertainty involved in decision making is not as pervasive as imagined by some scholars. Government coordination in the petrochemical industry, and likely in steel and automobile industries, also suffers only to a limited extent from the informational problem, as the number of players, potential investors, or technology buyers involved is small and the products are very homogeneous relative to those in other sectors. Of course, we do not claim that informational problems do not exist in the petrochemical industry. What the East Asian experience shows us is that the government can mitigate this problem by deliberately creating certain institutions. Examples of such institutions include Japan's Petrochemical Cooperative Discussion Group, Korea's Petrochemical Industry Promotion Committee, and Taiwan's investment coordination meetings sponsored by the Industrial Development Bureau. These groups or committees brought together policymakers, industrialists, and experts from academia and petrochemical industrial associations in the process of policy formation. Informational exchange between the government and the private sector through such a forum could not only reveal the need for government coordination in certain areas, but also provide the government with enough details on how best to coordinate the private sector's activities. Here we're looking at a selection from Pranab Bardhan's book from 2010, Awakening Giants, Feet of Clay, Assessing the Economic Rise of China and India. In both countries, some form of weak capitalism had developed many decades before liberation or independence. After liberation in 1950, China installed a socialist economy both in industry and agriculture. The private sector was minimal and operated on a minute scale and in the shadows. For the first 4 decades after independence, India had a much larger private sector than China did, but many of India's key and strategic industries were in the public sector, sometimes coexisting with the private sector in the same industry, for example, steel, and in other cases without private sector competition, for example, power plant equipment, manufacturing, or airlines. In the last 2 decades, the corporate sector has thrived in India, even though in the formal sector, state-owned companies still account for about 40% of total sales, and he's saying this in 2010. The Indian informal sector, including both farms and household enterprises outside agriculture, much larger than that in China, has been mostly privately owned. Even now, it employs nearly 94% of the labor force. But many of these are tiny enterprises, often family owned, cannot be quite described as capitalist business. If market prices are imputed for the inputs that they use, such as family labor, their business income is often persistently negative. They operate in the interstices of a low productivity, involuted economy, the capitalist parts of which cannot absorb them. Given the ideology of the long-ruling Communist Party, the transition to capitalism in China is the more fascinating and still somewhat contested story. Most people will agree that while the party retains its monopoly on power, much of the economy is no longer a command economy, with the market mechanism now being a major allocator of resources. About 95% of consumer prices are now market determined, although the state still controls prices in some key sectors such as financial services, telecommunications, utilities, and energy. Is the economy primarily capitalist now, with private owners of capital providing the dominant mode of organizing social and economic life through their drive for profit making and accumulation? The answer is still ambiguous, but there are some telling straws in the wind. Bardhan goes on to say that while a lot has changed in the last 2 decades, transitions tell us quite a bit about the structure of capitalist enterprise. As late as 1988, private firms with more than 8 employees were not permitted. Many private firms operated below the radar and used various subterfuges and covert deals with local officials as they prospered and adapted themselves to the changing permissible mores. Some of them used to be called red hat capitalists, sometimes hiding under the facade of local collectives. Only since the late 1990s have they slowly taken off their red hats and started coming out of the closet. For many years, government policy discriminated against private capital in matters of finance, market access, and regulatory approvals. As the profitability of TVEs, these stand for Town and Village Enterprises that were organized by the Communist Party. As the profitability of town and village enterprises declined with more intense competition, the fiscal gains relative to the responsibilities from hanging on to them diminished for local governments. This, along with collusion between local officials and local business, led to the policy of Fang Xiao, let go of the small, let go the small, and the privatization of TVEs. Legal status of particularly urban private companies and their access to bank finance slowly improved over the 1990s, especially after the official recognition of their importance at the 15th Party Congress in 1997. Foreign investment was in joint ventures with state-owned enterprises in the 1980s. It has mostly gone to wholly owned or joint venture private companies since the mid-1990s. More recently, business people were allowed to become members of the Communist Party, and already by 2005, there were more than 10 million such members. Currently, about one-third of the private entrepreneurs are members of the party. But Bardhan says the relationship between private business and the state is often rather clientistic. You know the word clientism. We've looked at it in a previous class. Businesses provide support to the state leadership, accept its pervasive control and guidance, and are more interested in a predictable business environment than in full democratization of the polity. And in exchange, they get political legitimacy and protection, better access to state resources, and at the local level, even partnership with officials. The role of the municipal governments of Taizhou and Wenzhou of Zhejiang province in developing the private sector ahead of the full legalization of private property rights is among the best known. On the basis of a statistical analysis of a large and representative sample of private firms, Li et al. Conclude that party membership helps private entrepreneurs to obtain loans, to have more confidence in the operation of the legal system, and in general to improve firm performance. Of course, it is well known that some of the entrepreneurs are in fact friends or relatives of party officials. Similarly, many state-owned enterprises are controlled by powerful political families. Thus, there is a new political managerial class, the members of which over the past 2 decades have converted their positions of authority into wealth and power. So this nexus of wealth and power is an extremely important one to follow in all political economy discussions. The vibrancy of entrepreneurial ambitions combined with the arbitrariness of power in an authoritarian state has sometimes given rise to particularly corrupt or predatory forms of capitalism unencumbered by the restraints of civil society institutions. In general, it is probably correct to say that while the party can undo individual capitalists at short notice, it will be much more difficult for the leadership to undo a whole network of capitalist relations, by now thickly overlaid with vested interests of various kinds. Individual entrepreneurs may have a clientistic relationship with the state, but the state, for all its relative autonomy, is now sufficiently enmeshed in a profits oriented system that has been identified with legitimacy enhancing international economic prowess and nationalist glory, a tiger that the political leadership may find difficult to dismount. A very important statement that we should pause and think about. Some analysts find in China's elements of the developmental state a familiar idea from the earlier East Asian growth literature. The role of large state-owned banks, including the China Development Bank, like the Korea Development Bank, Japan Development Bank, Taiwan Strategic Industry Fund, or the Small and Medium Business Guarantee Fund, has been crucial in industrial finance. In general, the financial system has been at the service of a state-directed industrial policy. Successful private companies in China, such as Huawei and Lenovo, have benefited a great deal from their close ties with the government. As in the rest of East Asia, export promotion combined with domestic technological capacity building and state encouragement of trial and experimentation in exploring dynamic comparative advantage, sometimes at the expense of static allocation efficiency, have been at the core of the development strategy. Yet, the Chinese case is also qualitatively different from the standard East Asian developmental state in several respects. So, we've already looked at two examples of the East Asian development case, or rather, three examples, less the Taiwan case, more South Korea and Japan in our previous reading, and we've already seen what strategies were employed there. So here he says, first, because of a different history of evolution of the private sector, which grew in the interstices of market reform in a socialist economy, the nature of embeddedness of the developmental bureaucracy was quite different in China. As mentioned earlier, until quite recently, private business operated below the radar, trying to ensure against the vagueness and uncertainty of private property rights by clustering with other private businesses in horizontal ties and building covert bridges with local government officials, and trying to overcome discrimination in access to state finance by drawing on lineage networks and overseas Chinese connections for credit and marketing. Thus, if Japan and South Korea are examples of coordinated capitalism, in which the nation state presided over and encouraged coordination of decisions and expectation, you saw a little bit of how that was done in the previous reading. Among private business conglomerates, the Chinese case has been described as that of state-led and controlled development from above, and that of network or guangxi capitalism from below, with a large number of family-owned businesses, in the latter forming clusters with informal credit and trade links among themselves and with the diaspora, and often in tacit or even open cooperation with local officials. Second, the issue of collaboration of private business with local officials also points to the substantial regional variations in the development of Chinese capitalism, as is inevitable in such a large country. Unlike in much of East Asia, fiscal and general economic decentralization has been much more advanced in China, and that itself has led to more diverse and diffuse industrial policies and operation, with a great deal of regional variance in industrial capability, business practices, and economic performance, and also in the nature of state business relationships. Intense competition between the enterprises of different localities and the strong link of cadre evaluation in the party with local economic performance paved the way for local alliances between politicians and business managers, particularly in coastal China. But in some interior regions, competition as well as the pattern of this alliance was patchy, and in general, local autonomy sometimes interfered with the implementation of a coordinated industrial policy in the country as a whole. Third, FDI, foreign direct investment, has played a much more important role in China compared to South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan in technological and managerial upgrading and international marketing. In 2002, in 10 large manufacturing subsectors in China at the two-digit level, two-digit SIC code, foreign invested firms accounted for nearly half the total sales. This is not unrelated to the weaker development of large private businesses in China. The Indian case has also been quite different from the East Asian developmental state. Although private business firms have a long history in India, in the first 3 decades after independence, they were relatively subdued, largely played a subsidiary role into the state leadership and privileged state production in the strategic and heavy industries, and learned to work out niches and modes of operation in a heavily regulated industrial environment. The bureaucratic elite was not particularly pro-business, either by inclination or ideology, or in terms of social composition, as the predominantly upper caste officers, the bureaucrats, often looked down on members of the mercantile class and did not have much of a direct stake in the fortunes of private capital. Of course, over time, a well-oiled machinery of delivery of requisite permits and licenses in exchange for bribes and political funding for elections developed between large private business and the political class. The social composition of the bureaucratic and political leadership also changed over time, with increasingly active participation of business, trader and farmer families, and other caste groups in politics and administration. In some regions, particularly Western and Southern India, local connections between the upcoming new capitalists, many of them from agricultural castes, and political organizations and authorities flourished, as in the case of the Kammas in Andhra Pradesh, Patidars in Gujarat, the Marathas in the sugar cooperatives of Maharashtra, and the Gaundars and Nadars of Tamil Nadu. By the 1980s, both in terms of social transformation and increasing acceptability of the ideology of the marketplace and of private ownership, the political culture became increasingly market friendly, although there was an obvious reluctance on the part of officials to let go of their discretionary powers and powers of intervention. In any case, the tightly knit links between business and officialdom of the East Asian type were difficult to forge in India, where elite fragmentation in an extremely heterogeneous society and the exigencies of populist electoral politics make such tight links politically suspect. And there's been a lot written about this in Indian political science and the history of Indian political economy. Pranab Bardhan is one of the persons who's written a lot about this himself, but there are many others as well. Yet, compared to the past, in the past couple of decades, the link between political or bureaucratic leadership and business associations such as the Confederation of Indian Industry on the matter of economic reform has been important in pushing the market principle and slowly establishing the general hegemony of capital in the political culture. Some of the new entrepreneurs, belonging as they do to the families of bureaucrats, army officers, and other members of the professional class, or sharing ties to education in elite engineering and business schools, have forged new links between the bureaucracy and private capital. The incidence of such linkage has been stronger in some industries and regions than in others. So he goes on to talk about what has happened in some of these new developments. I'm going to skip through this section. At the state government level, there's been a similar entente between regional capital and state administration, at least in some states. For example, Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. Sinha emphasizes the strategies that regional elites and politicians have played all along in navigating through and mitigating even the pre-reform restrictive policy regime of the central government at its local implementation level in their pursuit of the regional developmental state, as in Gujarat. Even in the domain legally under the control of the Central Ministry of Industry, the porous nature of the structure of joint industrial governance leaves enough room for regional elites to maneuver. And a lot of this maneuvering takes place around land in particular, as you will see through some case studies if we have a chance to do them. The regional political imperatives were, of course, different in different parts of India, and accordingly, the institutional practices and outcomes was sharply different, as in the contrasting cases of Gujarat and West Bengal show. Even after the major deregulatory reforms since the 1980s, state governments hold considerable power over a new firm in getting land, water, and electricity connections and labor and environmental clearances. And in this, different states have performed with different degrees of alacrity. I'm going to go very quickly through this chapter, poverty and inequality. How is the growth shared? In both China and India, there's a general sense that much of the benefit of economic growth has been concentrated, that large masses of people are still very poor, and that the process of global integration of these two countries, for all the hype in the financial press, has left many people behind. In this chapter, we will discuss this issue with the help of the available empirical data and come to conclusions that are somewhat more ambiguous than are suggested in the popular discussion. First, take the case of absolute poverty, the scourge of both countries for at least the past 2 centuries. There's a large literature on the intricacies of poverty measurement, how to define a poverty line, if at all possible, and how it is related to local nutritional norms or the consumption basket of the poor. A head count of people below such a line does not capture the intensity of poverty among the different poor groups. There are large and increasing gaps between estimates of consumption expenditure derived from alternative sources such as national income accounts and the household survey data, both of which have problems and are not quite comparable. What is an appropriate price index to use to deflate the monetary expenditure of the poor, and so on. For this chapter, we shall largely ignore all this. So here are some measures of poverty based on $1 a day per capita in 2005 purchasing parity terms. So you see that China's poverty started to dramatically decline relative to where it was 73.5% in 1981 and about 8.1% in 2005. These are headcount measures. In India, there's been a much more modest decline. And even if you look at the numbers of people who remain in poverty, there's a dramatic decline in China and a much less dramatic one in India, at least between 1981 and 2005. It is often claimed, both in the media and academia, that it was global integration that brought down the extreme poverty that had afflicted the two countries over many decades. While expansion of exports and labor-intensive manufactures probably lifted many people out of poverty in China in the past decade, not in India, where exports are still mainly skill and capital-intensive, the more important reason for the dramatic decline of poverty over the last 3 decades may actually lie elsewhere. Table 6. So let's take a look at Table 6. Table 6 suggests that more than half the total decline in the numbers of poor people below the poverty line of $1 a day per capita in China between 1981 and 2005 had already happened by the 1980s, before the big strides in foreign trade and investment in China in the 1990s and later. Much of the extreme poverty was concentrated in rural areas, and its large decline in the first half of the 1980s is perhaps mainly a result of the spurt in agricultural growth following decollectivization and one of history's most egalitarian land redistributions, with every rural family getting an equal piece of land, subject to differences in family size and regional average, in addition to an upward readjustment of farm procurement prices. These are mostly internal factors that had very little to do with global integration. To settle the issue of how much of the poverty decline is due to globalization and how much due to largely domestic factors, one needs causal models which have not been econometrically tested much in the literature. In an attempt to econometrically measure on the basis of a time series of province level data the effects of different factors on rural poverty reduction in China, Fang, Zhang, and Zhang show that since the mid 1980s, domestic public investment, particularly in education, agricultural research and development, roads, and other rural infrastructure, has been the dominant factor both in growth and in rural poverty reduction, much more than economic reform. In India, National Sample Survey data suggests that the rate of decline in poverty did not accelerate in 1993 to 2005, the period of intensive opening of the economy compared to the 1970s and 1980s. This may be connected with the fact that agricultural output and total factor productivity grew at a slower rate in the past decade compared to the earlier decade. This may be largely on account of the decline in public investment in rural infrastructure, such as irrigation roads and the prevention of soil erosion, which has little to do with globalization. NSS data also suggests that there's been a decline in the rate of growth of real wages in the period 1993 to 2005 compared to the previous decade, 1983 to 1993. We should also recognize that private consumer expenditure data of the NSS that are used in poverty estimates, as with the Chinese household survey data, do not capture the declining access to environmental resources, such as forests, fisheries, grazing lands, and water, both for drinking and irrigation, on which the daily lives and livelihoods of the poor depend. If you take health indicators, the results are even more stark. The percentage of underweight children younger than age 3 is 46 in India and about 30% on average in sub-Saharan Africa, 8% in China. Take the case of Gujarat, one of the richest, highest growth and highest reform states in India. The percentage of underweight children, which was already higher than sub-Saharan Africa, went up between NFHS 2 1988-99 survey and NFHS 3 2005-2006. Similarly, disaggregated studies across districts in India have found trade liberalization actually slowing down the decline in rural poverty. Such results may indicate the difficulty of displaced farmers and workers in adjusting to new activities and sectors on account of various constraints, For example, in getting credit or information or infrastructural facilities such as power and roads, high incidence of school dropouts, and labor market rigidities, even when new opportunities are opened up by globalization. The other thing that Bardhan points out is that there has been a type of unequal development. So if you look at the average weekly real wage by level of education, in other words, accounting for inflation, how has income or how have wages gone up over the past 3 decades? You see this trend for those who have college education and up, and those who only have a primary or less education, their real wage has been more or less stagnant. Regional disparity in income or consumption is greater in China than in India. But over the past 2 decades, China's backward regions have grown at rates almost comparable to its advanced regions, and regional earning disparities may be narrowing, although not yet per capita income disparities. Initiatives such as the Western Development Program supported large infrastructure building in remote regions, and the mobility restricting effects of the hukou system may be weakening. In India, the poorer states, largely concentrated in the central and eastern regions, have grown much more slowly than richer states, mostly in the west and south. So relative inequality has increased. How does he end this chapter? He says, in this chapter, after describing the decline in poverty, dramatic in China, solid in India, we show that the relationship between poverty reduction and market reform or globalization is more ambiguous than is usually claimed. The impact of growth on poverty reduction is weaker in India than in China, probably on account of initial conditions, including larger inequality of opportunity in India, owing to inequalities of land, education, and social status. The link between economic reform and inequality is also ambiguous and difficult to disentangle from the effects of other ongoing changes. There is some limited evidence of significant intergenerational mobility in China, but not much in India.